resume. We're talking about some of Marion's cooking, and we mentioned the fact that one of the favorite dishes that she made that I liked were the popovers, and along with the sauerbraten. Also, one of the favorite desserts that Marion made that I liked very much was her pumpkin pie. The so-called secret ingredient in her pumpkin pie was the use of the spice mace in addition to the nutmeg. And that gave it an additional flavor that is not ordinarily used. She also had a secret recipe for making brownies, chocolate brownies. And she had a recipe there that she would not give to anybody else, because she said if I gave it to somebody else, she said it would never be a treat. She used to serve it to a Spitzer club that she belonged to, and I'll talk about that a little later on. I don't know, and I haven't been able to find her recipe for chocolate brownies, but I do remember a couple of the ingredients that may be just a little bit different for some people, that maybe I was responsible for it. She used, as part of the liquid, she used coffee, strong coffee, and she also used butter, a lot of butter, and she used a certain amount of whipping cream, old-fashioned, full-bodied whipping cream as a part of that recipe. She served that primarily, often made it for the so-called Spitzer Club that she belonged to. The Spitzer Club was a group of about 8 or 10 girls, mostly teachers, who got together starting about 1942, and they met all during the course of the school year, about every 2 weeks. They would go to various homes and they would play Spitzer, just for pure entertainment, and it was always a lot of fun. Some of the girls that belonged to that, along with Marion, were like Betty Clark Gregg, Elda Warwick, Ruth Adams Hamilton, Erna Fleming Bartelt, Dora Brady, Ruby Larson Frederick, and Lenore Tipman, Marie Selke Garrett, Beth Heller. And they played for about 2 hours and then had lunch and exchanged information. This club lasted from about 1942 to 1972. And it's at that luncheon that Marion would serve her brownies. The girls would want the recipe, and Marion would say, no, that's mine. I might add that card clubs were very common in the small town years ago, as they still are today. And they play a local game here called Spitzer, which is known primarily throughout Presque Isle County and the adjacent Alpena County. And there are Spitzer clubs that are still operating today that are reported in the local paper. Now, another Spitzer club that I recall is that my dad belonged to a Spitzer club for many, many years, and I recall playing in it as a substitute. I wasn't a regular member, and I remember some of the members in Dad's club that, again, lasted for about 35 years, from about the year 1935 to 1970. Some of the members were just town friends, such as Gus Kane, Joe Valton, Milt Hoffer, Paul Thumney, Lloyd Gooden, Dr. Gordon Moffat, he was a public health officer, Bob Munt, Carl Rieger, and Ben Lound. And there again, they would just alternate between the various homes about every 2 weeks or once a month, whatever it happened to be. And that went for many, many years. It was a lot of fun. Another thing that I can recall from my early days was my involvement with Boy Scouts. I was a member of the first Boy Scout group organized up here in Rogers City. And that was about 1923 in that era. And it was organized by Dr. Holland Belfry, who was the first minister of the Presbyterian Church here in Rogers City. And he lived just down the street in the house which is now the manse for the Presbyterian Church. And I recall that his daughter, one of his daughters, Marion, was in my class in about the 4th or 5th grade. His assistant at that organizing that Boy Scout was Bill Schultz. Now, Bill Schultz was a local fellow that lived in the neighborhood when I was a kid, and then he went on to U of M, and then he became the head of the science department at Grambua School, which is in Birmingham, Michigan, a well-known private institution. And Bill was very, very successful. And I used to encounter him when I was going to the University of Michigan. He was there working on an advanced degree also. And after he retired, he donated a planetarium to the school here in Roger City, which is still there, still in the old high school building. A beautiful, beautiful device for the teaching of astronomy. He was the head of the astronomy department at Cranbrook, in addition to being the head of the science department. Other Boy Scout leaders that I remember, my second one was Irvin Clymer. He later became the president here of Michigan Line, and he was very interested in Boy Scout work. I advanced up through the first class Boy Scout badge, and had worked on a good number of merit badges for my life or other scouting badges. Our principal activity, of course, in addition to the meetings, was going camping in the summertime. We camped at Swan Lake. We camped at Little Lake on plant property. We camped at the state park here in Onaway, and also a Lower State Park on Mullet Lake. And we camped at Grand Lake, and we camped at Lawn Lake. Those were happy days. Other scouts that were part of that first group that was organized was my brother Herman. It was Herb Trapp, Ed Schultz, Ivan Hamilton, Ortvan Tush, Frank Ware, Jack Munson, Frank Warwick, Frank Crush, Ray Saban. Those are some of them that I remember. There were about 25 in all. And my expertise, or my function in this organization, was that I was the official flag man, or I would send message by the Boy Scout flag system. We'll talk about other things later on. Now to pick up on a few other items that I'd like to mention. One of them was that in the early years, when it was just Herman and I in the family, before George and the other girls came along, we spoke German very, very often between the four of us. And I became quite fluent, and of course so did Herman too. Now that doesn't mean that we didn't also use English. Yes, we used it all the time, but in many of the conversations that were held around the kitchen table or the lunch table or whatever it happened to be, when there was nobody else around, we would converse in German, and of course it made for a good vocabulary development. And so it was a kind of bilingual thing. Now this was common with a lot of people in the area at that time. Some of the families spoke German, some of them spoke Polish, and then some of them spoke both. Dad became quite conversant in Polish. He said as a young man he taught in the Posen school system, and from there he picked up a lot of the vocabulary in Polish, and he said it became very handy to him later on when he went into the banking business, because in certain cases, he says, some of these people came in, they found it very, very difficult to speak in English, but he knew just enough Polish to get by, and these people appreciated it very much. So now I think another thing I might mention briefly, and that is in regard to the automobile. That first automobile that Dad bought, I think it was 1919, a Model T Ford, and that was frequently, before the Ford, we went to out in the country, to Metz and to other places. We went by horse and buggy. In the summertime we used the horse and buggy, in the wintertime we used the sleigh. And quite often we went out to see the grandparents, either the Grambua family or the Grambrook family, and we would stay over the weekend and come back on a Sunday afternoon. The horse would be put up for the night in their own barn, and then the next day Dad would take the sleigh or the buggy and the horse back to the stable as he went to work. But we spent many a weekend out in the country with the grandparents. The car, later on when the car came into being, of course, in the wintertime, that car was put up on jacks or on blocks to take the pressure off of the inner tubes. And because the roads were not plowed, so you just didn't use the car in the wintertime until later on. And and also in the wintertime, the battery was taken out and stored in the basement or some other place in the house so that it wouldn't freeze. So in the wintertime was given over pretty much to the sleighs and to the horses until such time that they got the roads plowed. I also want to mention about the fact that in the early days around home there, we always had a dog as long as I can remember. I remember one of the first dogs that I remember, his name was Jack. And then later on, in the era, or when George and the rest of the kids came along, the dog's name that we had was always Kazan, K-A-Z-A-N. Now, the way that thing got started was that about that time, a book came out, a novel, and it was written by a Michigan author by the name of James Oliver Curwood. And the title of the book was Kazan. It was a story of an Alaskan dog, I suppose a malamute or something like that they have now, and talked about his great heroic efforts and how wise and how sharp he was. And so the dog that we had, I don't know what his name was at the time, but it was immediately changed to Kazan, and they became Kazans from that on, except for one period of time when we had a big St. Bernard dog by the name of Blondine for a period of a couple of years. But that's an entirely different story. Now, at that same time, we did have, as I remember, only one cat that I ever recall. It seems that the barn, or the garage, later the garage, became infested with mice because there was grain stored in there and other food from the yard. And so Dad went out the country and borrowed a cat from a farmer. And the cat was brought in, told him to get into the barn, close the door, and get to work. Well, the cat, by gosh, did clean out the mice. And he became a kind of a pet there for a while. And his name was Emil. And now the question is, how would you name a cat Emil? How did you even know it was a he or a her? I don't know that. But anyway, the way the story is, as I remember it, one of the neighbors came over and said, "Oh, George, I see you got a cat." He said, "Yeah." He said, "What's the problem?" Well, he said, "I got mice in the barn." He said, "Do you have a name for the cat?" And Dad said, "Yeah, Emil." He said, the word just came right out of his mouth. He said he doesn't know why he said Emil. He could have said Amelia. He said, but it came out Emil. And so Emil became a kind of a pet for a period of 2, 3 months or 4 months or whatever we had it. Finally, the mice were cured, and Dad took the cat back and thanked the farmer for the use of his cat. And the cat was glad to get home, I suppose. Now I'd like to comment on one more thing while we're at it here about the house. And that is, you all remember the big wood stove where Mother prepared all those wonderful meals for all of us kids all through the years. That stove was a dandy. It was a big stove, and it had 6 lids, and it had a fire chamber. It had a big warming oven, and it had a regular oven which would hold anywhere from 8 to 10 loaves depending upon the size of the pans that you used, and it had about a 4-quart hot water reservoir. It was a fine, very, very fine instrument. And immediately attached thereto was a hot water tank of 30 gallons. That hot water tank was heated by a coil system within the framework of the firing department. That was a wood stove, and of course it burned wood, it burned hardwood. The hardwood was brought in from the country in large loads by farmers, dumped on the side of the house, maybe 10, 15, 20 cords at a time, and then it was our job to split that wood up. That wood came in big blocks or big chunks, and in the round, and Herb and I and Dad, and later on even George, got out there with hammers and mauls and sledgehammers, wedges, and that wood was split up. It had to be split into areas about 2 by 2, 2 by 3, 3 by 3, or 3 by 4, just so it could fit into the fire area of the stove, because and it took a lot of wood to keep that fire going year in, year out, 7 days a week, and so you had quite a pile of wood that you had to have alongside of the house. There used to be anywhere from 6, 8, 10, 15 cords of wood out on the side of the house drying, because as the drier the wood came, sometimes that wood would be out there for a couple of years before it was used. And then in certain instances, a certain amount of that wood, maybe 3, 4, 5 cords of it, were put into the basement. So that in very, very inclement weather, you didn't have to go out and drag in wood from outside. You see, that wood had to be supplied every day, every day, every day. They had to keep the wood boxes full. So in very, very bad weather, you did have a certain reservoir of it down the basement. Also, large chunks of wood, which you were too hard to split, were used in the furnace, in addition to the coal that was burned. But in the early days, after the house was first built, wood was what was burned in that furnace. And then later on, coal came in through the plant, and then was distributed and sold throughout the community, the soft coals. And but wood was the preferred method of heating in those early days. The daily chore, of course, for us kids was to make sure that the wood boxes were full. Every day of the year, that was all there was to it. The wood boxes had to be filled, otherwise you didn't eat. So we'll talk about a few other things later on.